Welcome back to Global Frontlines. I'm your host, and today we dive into a story that's sending ripples through Washington, Brussels, Moscow, and Beijing alike. U.S. President Donald Trump has once again taken to his favorite platform, Truth Social, to issue a dramatic new proposal. He says he is ready to impose major sanctions on Russia, but only if every NATO member fully commits to banning Russian oil and joining the sanctions campaign. And that's not all. Trump also suggested NATO allies consider slapping tariffs of 50 to 100% on China for its continued purchases of Russian petroleum. This is a high-stakes play, mixing energy security, geopolitics, and economic warfare. So, what's really behind Trump's latest ultimatum? Could NATO realistically comply, and how might Russia, China, and Europe react? Let's break it down. On September 13, Trump wrote that he is ready to do major sanctions on Russia when all NATO nations have agreed, and when all NATO nations stop buying oil from Russia. He went further, blasting some NATO members for what he called a lack of commitment to victory in Ukraine. He claimed that if NATO does as he says, the war will end quickly and countless lives will be saved, but if not, the United States is wasting its time, energy, and money. This is vintage Trump, bold, conditional, and combative. It's not the first time he has threatened sweeping sanctions, but historically he has not always followed through. Still, the language here matters. He is effectively tying U.S. sanctions policy to NATO unity, flipping the script from Washington leading by example to Washington demanding collective action first. Now, NATO is a military alliance, not an economic bloc. While its members coordinate on defense, trade and energy policy remain largely national or European Union matters. Some NATO countries have drastically cut Russian imports since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But others remain reliant. Turkey is the third largest buyer of Russian oil products after China and India. Hungary continues to import Russian crude through pipelines. Slovakia also relies on Russian supplies. Convincing these countries to halt purchases entirely would be politically and economically painful. For example, Hungary has repeatedly clashed with Brussels over energy sanctions, warning that cutting off Russian oil would devastate its economy. Trump's demand effectively exposes the cracks within NATO, unity on defense, but division on energy. And it raises the question, does Trump want to pressure Russia, or pressure NATO? Perhaps the most surprising part of Trump's message was his suggestion that NATO impose tariffs of 50 to 100% on China. Why China? Because Beijing has become Moscow's lifeline. As Western markets dried up, China stepped in to buy discounted Russian crude and gas. This has helped fund Russia's war machine and soften the blow of Western sanctions. Trump's logic is straightforward. If China faces heavy tariffs from NATO countries, it may rethink its support for Moscow. But there are problems. NATO doesn't set trade policy. The EU does for Europe, and individual governments do elsewhere. Europe relies on China for trade in other areas, from machinery to consumer goods to green technology components. A sudden 50% tariff could spark a full-scale trade war, hurting NATO economies just as much, if not more, than China. And beyond that, China has already deepened ties with Russia through currency swaps, joint projects, and diplomatic backing. Tariffs alone may not sever that bond. Trump's critics say this is more about optics than policy. By demanding NATO move first, Trump shifts responsibility away from Washington. If sanctions don't happen, he can blame allies for being weak. If they do, he can claim credit for forcing them into line. This also fits his broader worldview. He has long accused NATO members of being freeloaders, not pulling their weight, and exploiting U.S. protection without contributing enough. His post also reflects a transactional mindset. In his view, the United States should only commit resources if others fully commit too. He frames it as protecting American time, energy, and money. But here's the irony. NATO has already funneled billions into supporting Ukraine. European states, especially Poland and the Baltics, have increased defense spending and hosted millions of refugees. Yet Trump portrays them as half-hearted. So is this strategy about ending the war quickly, or about reshaping NATO in Trump's image of burden sharing? Moscow is watching closely. If NATO truly united behind Trump's demand, Russia's oil revenues would collapse. Sanctions and embargoes already cost Russia dearly, but sales to China, India, and Turkey have kept the economy afloat. If those doors close, Putin faces a financial crisis that could weaken his war machine. But the Kremlin likely calculates that NATO will never achieve such unity. Hungary, Turkey, and Slovakia provide convenient escape valves. As for China, it would see tariffs of 50 to 100% as a direct act of economic aggression. Beijing has already warned that Western sanctions on Russia are illegitimate. Retaliation, tariffs on European exports, restrictions on US companies, even closer ties to Moscow, would be almost certain. In other words, Trump's idea may escalate tensions not just with Russia, but with China as well. This debate comes against a tense backdrop. Just days earlier, Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace, prompting Poland's military to shoot them down. That's NATO territory, raising alarms about direct escalation. NATO has since announced a new mission to bolster its eastern flank. The message is clear: the alliance takes Russian provocation seriously. Trump's message, demanding harsher measures, feeds into this climate of anxiety. For some allies, it may seem like reckless escalation. For others, it may feel like necessary deterrence. So, where could this go? One possibility is NATO unity, with allies agreeing to Trump's plan, cutting off Russian oil and imposing tariffs on China. That would deal a severe blow to Moscow, but at huge cost to Europe and potentially sparking a trade war with Beijing. Another possibility is partial compliance, where some NATO members tighten sanctions but Turkey, Hungary, and others resist. Trump could then claim NATO is weak and refuse to act, preserving the status quo but increasing tensions inside the alliance. And the third scenario is stalemate, with no major changes happening, Russia continuing to sell to China, NATO remaining divided, and Trump continuing to issue threats without follow-through. This is the most probable outcome, given past patterns. At the end of the day, Trump's statement is less about immediate policy and more about leverage over NATO, over Russia, and even over China. But the risks are high. Energy dependence, economic interdependence, and political divides make his proposal extremely difficult to implement. And yet, the message resonates with Trump's supporters: America should not act alone, NATO should step up, and China should pay a price for siding with Russia. Whether this approach brings peace closer, or drives the world deeper into confrontation, remains an open question. One thing is clear: the intersection of oil, war, and global power politics has rarely been more combustible. Thank you for joining me on Global Frontlines. Stay tuned, stay informed, and until next time, stay sharp.